On November 17, 1989, communist rule was ending in Czechoslovakia. During the rule of the communist regime, it was difficult to lead a democratic movement. But then, things began to change. The Magic Lantern was the unique headquarters of the Czech Revolution of 1989, the revolution that would end in compromise because of the smooth, velvet, poetic words of Václav Havel. The events of November 1989 did not happen in a vacuum. They happened after decades of subtle uprisings.
The Prague Uprising began at the end of World War II. On May 5, 1945, the people began to protest in Wenceslas Square. This continued until May 8th, eventually ending in a ceasefire when the Soviets entered the city with tanks to help finish the liberation from the Germans. Czechoslovakia was finally free of German occupation for the first time since late 1938. While this freedom was welcomed, the political scene in Czechoslovakia following World War II was quite complex. Edward Beneš was the head of the London-based Czechoslovakian government in exile during the war. He returned in 1945 to take control of the new national government and soon realized that there were many communist as well as Nazi sympathizers in the country. Beneš decided that the moderate socialism was a better choice than Nazism and let the communists take over the government. At this time, the United States adopted the U.S. Marshall Plan. This was an economic recovery program designed to help war-torn European countries rebuild as efficiently as possible. Many non-communist Czechs wanted to participate in such a plan. However, communists disagreed, so they formed a militia of 15,000 members and began clamping down on opposition parties. This led to the February Communist coup in Prague, 1948. Despite his initial support, Beneš refused to sign a pro-communist constitution and later abdicated. It was Beneš's hesitation in February of 1948 that allowed the communists to take over the government and make Czechoslovakia a totalitarian state, leading to 40 years of strict isolation.
During this oppressive time, a young Václav Havel wrote a play about his life as a soldier. For this, he was discharged from the army and the play was shut down. In 1960, communism was declared as the official state policy of the new Czechoslovak Socialist Republic. In 1963, Havel wrote The Memorandum, a play about bureaucracy that also won an Obie. This was one of the early signs that Havel could reach and influence many people with just his words. In 1968, the first Secretary of Czechoslovakia, Alexander Dubček, wanted economic liberalization and some freedom of press. However, this led to the Soviet invasion and occupation of Czechoslovakia in August of 1968, an event known as the 1968 Prague Spring. By mid-August 1968, Soviets sent 5,000 tanks and 2 million troops into Czechoslovakia to put down liberal views. These tanks had orders to quell the opposition, establishing tight control over the Czechoslovak citizens for the next 2 decades. In 1974, Havel was interrogated and arrested due to anti-parasite laws. For this, the gifted playwright faced a major conflict and decided to become a more active revolutionary.
In 1975, Havel wrote a letter to the president of Czechoslovakia, Gustav Husak, protesting the moral crisis in the country. Havel believed that the government's suppression of human rights had to be addressed. Instead, many more restrictions against theaters were put into place. Angered by this, Havel then wrote 2 one-act plays about a dissident writer. This play then became forbidden literature. In January 1977, Václav Havel was leading the Charter 77 movement, a group of young Czechoslovakians who called for the government to adhere to the human rights provisions of the 1975 Helsinki Accords. Because of his involvement with this group, he faced weeks of interrogation and was eventually sent to prison. From prison in 1978, Havel published The Power of the Powerless. This focused on how the communist regime was breeding dissidents out of ordinary people, like himself. While Havel was in prison, there are many compromises taking place in Eastern Europe. In 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet premier, reforms were put into place and they began to create a more lenient atmosphere in the Soviet Union. These reforms acted as a catalyst for many of the non-violent democratic revolutions that erupted in the Soviet bloc countries, such as Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. These governments saw what happened during China's Tiananmen Square events and soon feared bloodshed in their streets as the result of a revolution.
Think of the difference. In China, the same thing happened. The students went out to demonstrate and they rolled over them with tanks. In Prague, the students demonstrated, had their heads knocked, then they rose up and threw out the government.
But Czechoslovakia's Communist Party only tightened its control and political activists were punished very harshly. From 1979 through 1983, a still imprisoned Havel wrote his wife Olga regular letters that were censored by the government. This further proves that the government was worried and knew that Havel's words could influence compromise in a new, peaceful way.
On December 10, 1988, for the first time in over 20 years, there was a protest in Czechoslovakia. Havel decided to take part in these protests by using his plays, criticizing communist rule as his form of protest. These protesters were met with minimal but brutal force.
And I was talking to a young diplomat in the foreign ministry, and I said, why do you beat up demonstrators that it makes you look perfectly awful. He said, yeah, I said, I know. He said, but he said, if it's 10,000 people out there demonstrating, he said, that can be handled. He said, now if it was over 100,000, well, that was pretty interesting for this guy to say that a year before the revolution.
Instead of discouraging the demonstrators, the government's actions not only made the people want to protest more, it also encouraged more citizens to join the demonstrations. Nonetheless, the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia continued to carry out the policies of censorship in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall. These politically repressive conditions, combined with the collapse of the Soviet Union, inspired the Czechoslovaks to demand a change from their government. In the last 6 weeks of 1989, opposition activists staged what became known as the Velvet Revolution to overthrow communist government in Czechoslovakia. Velvet is associated with Czechoslovakia's democratic revolution because it was a peaceful movement ending in compromise. Havel, with his smooth words and preference for non-violence action, made him the perfect person to lead this movement. Lou Reed's Velvet Underground catalyzed the adoption of Velvet by the Czech civic activists. Velvet Underground also influenced a Czech band, the Plastic People of the Universe. This music was becoming the focal point of the movement.
Plastic People of the Universe. They kept getting arrested just for wanting to play their music in their cabins. And Havel said, "This is where we take our stand."
Many students and young people began voicing their opinions on a daily basis. All of these students disliked communist rule and looked towards Václav Havel as a leader. On November 17, 1989, a demonstration took place to mark the anniversary of the death of Jan Opital, a Czech student who was murdered by the Nazis 50 years before. Once speeches began, more people began to flock to the square, and this quickly turned into an anti-government protest.
Motivated the people in the streets in the Velvet Revolution was, "I am just sick of this nonsense,"
marking the beginning of the spontaneous Velvet Revolution. Students ran to Narodny Street and into Wenceslas Square. They were met by riot police and then were all cut off and surrounded. Demonstrators took a peaceful approach to the riot police by either placing down flowers, lighting candles, or kneeling in front of the police. Although students chanted "We have bare hands" to show their peaceful nature, 167 student protesters were hospitalized after being beaten. Following the student demonstrations, mass protests were held in several cities across the country. During a discussion held in the basement of the Magic Lantern Theater in Prague, a group called the Civic Forum was established and quickly became the spokespeople of the democratic movement. Havel became the leader in the Civic Forum. The Civic Forum was now the sole pro-democracy group that was the face of the revolution to the whole world. Between the dates of November 21st through the 26th, the protests in Wenceslas Square grew from 200,000 to 500,000 people and had to be moved to the Letna Plain. On the 26th, police brutality was at its peak, causing the police to issue a public apology to all of the demonstrators. Knowing this was just a way for the government to try and slow down the revolution, protests continued. On November 27th, 75% of the Czech population participated in a 2-hour general strike. The strike, which bolstered the demands put forth by the opposition movement, ended the popular phase of the Velvet Revolution, as Havel and the Civic Forum successfully showed the communist regime that the Czech people would no longer obey.
When the embassy saw the general strike succeed only 10 days after the first demonstrations, we figured that this was a real revolution.
Havel officially became the face of the Czech opposition and led the group in talks with the government in early December 1989. The Communist Party was pushed into negotiating with Havel and the Civic Forum, creating a new political climate. Havel brought the ideas and political views of the Civic Forum to the negotiations, but was always willing to compromise. The group demanded the resignation of the communist government, the release of prisoners of conscience, and investigations into the November 17th police action.
The Communist Party officially ceded its political power in Czechoslovakia to allow for a multi-party rule on November 28th, just one day after the citizens' general strike. On December 10th, Communist President Gustav Husak resigned, and on the 29th, the Czech parliament appointed Václav Havel, a poet and a playwright, to the presidency of a free Czechoslovakia. Through compromise, the new government liberalized Czechoslovak law with respect to both politics and the economy, creating an open and free society. If it were not for Václav Havel, this conflict may not have been as peaceful or as smooth as it really was. For his civic activism and political leadership, Havel has received numerous awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Order of Canada, and the International Gandhi Prize, and many more. Havel has become an inspiration to democratic movements and compromise across the globe. Through his numerous plays, quotes, and speeches, Václav Havel not only became the playwright, but the director and the leading actor in his life's greatest work, The Velvet Revolution.